What's up, everyone? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Brian and myself have Coach Kassem Hanson on, creator of N1, and just all-around guy who talks so much deep levels of knowledge around lifting weights and how to train more efficiently and better. And I cannot wait to get into this conversation. But before we jump in, I'm going to have Cass introduce himself, and then we are going to give our past week updates.
What's up, everybody? I'm Coach Kassem, and if you're not familiar with me, I'm one of those coaches that has kind of, transitioned into the education space. So we do a lot in terms of teaching foundational biomechanics, just helping people be efficient with movement. And in the last 2 years, we actually have got our own in-house lab, and so we've walked into the research, genre, as you will say, and so that's been a really cool thing. So if you're interested in kind of both practical and really nerdy content around exercise selection and how to perform exercise, that's kind of our bread and butter.
Yeah, I think Aaron and I can both attest to the fact that you have been a huge influence on specifically our exercise selection and exercise execution over the last year. And we talk about you and your work at N1 a lot on this podcast. So I know we're really excited, and I know our listeners are as well.
Yeah, for me specifically, I remember probably about a year ago, Brian, right as we were launching the podcast, we were talking music up, and you were like, "Oh, you've heard of Kassem and N1?" And I was like, "No," and then just went down a rabbit hole. And I mean, it's changed. It's changed so much of how I approach things and just efficiency and stuff. And so, I mean, great timing. Like I said, I'm super excited for the practical. Next week, I feel like it's just going to elevate my knowledge and to just a whole new level, which I can't wait to learn from.
Yep.
Yeah, the hands-on experience definitely is unparalleled. There's no amount of videos that you can watch that will replace being able to see and experience this stuff in real life. That's just, I love it. It's my favorite weekend of every month is when we have the hands-on event.
Yeah, your passion shines through, so that's cool. Very cool. Aaron, what's been going on in your last 7 days?
So not too much. Training has been, going well. I have made up my mind on which gym I'm going to go to. I'm going to end up driving to the far gym just because of the pendulum and in the hack squat that's there. I mean, it's like you said, having access to those, it's kind of unparalleled. And I don't know, once we start, traveling, at further distances again, the next time I will get them. So I'm going to take advantage of that. So I decided that. Kind of a business standpoint thing, a little bit of an update. I've been working behind the scenes on creating a course for my done-for-you client check-in system to really help the purchaser just really get up to speed there. And then another little tidbit, I'm working on a cryptocurrency integration, which is something that I've wanted to do for a very long time. So pretty much since I started my company. So that is in the final details as well, be able to accept cryptocurrency payments for services and products.
Very cool. I guess in my last 7 days, I am still fighting this fatigue bug from deadlifting, and I just can't seem to beat it. So I'm going to take basically a deload taper week this week, try and flush a bunch of this fatigue, and then I'm just ready to be done with strength training. So next week I'm going to do my assessment testing week and see if I can kind of meet some of the objectives that I set for myself before starting this thing. And then hopefully the week of 12/6, I'll be able to get back into hypertrophy work, and looking forward to that, man. Looking forward to that a ton. So that's pretty much where I stand right now. Looking forward to recovering the rest of this week, doing some low-key training, and continuing to play around with my new functional trainer. And that's the update from me. We'll talk more about all that stuff next week when we don't have a guest. Cass, what's going on in your world?
I feel like I have different priorities than you guys, because I've been, thinking about procuring the pie that I need for Thanksgiving and, all fat kid motivated things. I think that's been my concern this last week. It's like, all right, are we going to get this? Like, where can I get drums? Like, that's been my main obstacle this last week, because I don't know when you'll be listening to this, but this is this is Thanksgiving week. Yep. For all of you listeners here. But outside of that, I kind of took a little bit of break after our last event, and so I actually did a big podcast binge. So you guys, I think, are my 6th podcast in 4 days. So it's been fun, actually, because with the opening of the facility, I've been very isolated and focused on that. And so, getting back and having conversations with people is really good. And one of the things that, we've been kind of focusing on in a couple of these has actually been kind of talking about, some nerdy stuff. And that's one of my favorite things is when I get to actually talk to people and, go into some of that nerdy details that you don't necessarily get to have in casual conversation. So it's always good to be able to exercise that portion of your brain and just making sure that, like, am I just sitting here in my own thoughts, like going down the wrong rabbit hole? I need that other person to bounce those ideas off or to question me and whatnot. And so that's why it's like, okay, this is good to be having conversations with people, that ask hard questions and stuff again.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was actually going to ask you whether you got a lot of similar conversations, topics, and questions across the 6 podcasts you've done.
I mean, it's been a variety. The one thing that I would say there was consistency about was I had 2 instances, and I actually you shared a video today of talking about some of the physics stuff in the Doug Brignoli videos, because he was recently just featured on Mark Bell's podcast. So all of a sudden, that got more, that more eyeballs got on that. And so that's like the new hot debate for us right now is like looking at this, biomechanics and physics discussion here and looking at those models. But everything else it's kind of all over. I think it really just kind of depends on what a person's experience is with us. Most people, if they're finding out about us, they think like, oh, we're just, these are just the mechanics or exercise people. But the people that are more familiar know that we go into the nuances of physiology for program design and stuff like that. And so we get things that are all over the place. It just kind of depends on how familiar that person is, with our content and with our information.
Yeah, and their audience for sure. You got to be able to speak to the level of the audience.
Oh yeah,
yeah, for sure. That's awesome. Well, I'm excited to jump in and listen to some of those as they come out too. Aaron, anything else before we kind of jump in here?
No, let's do it. Let's jump in.
All right, cool. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was your kind of unique diet approach. I find myself eating somewhat similar. And Aaron is mostly in the nutrition space more, so I kind of handle like the training, education, program design side of things, and he's more of the nutrition guy. So if you can just tell us a little bit about your diet, how you came to be eating that way, and then maybe we'll have a follow-up question or two.
Well, so what I did is I found a diet that really suits my biases, because ever since I was a kid, I hated eating vegetables, right? So let's just put that out there first, right? Let's just be clarified. But I mean, so essentially, the way I eat now, and I've gone back and forth with this with Ben House on whether we should be calling it carnivore or bronivore, which is basically it's like, okay, if I'm the carnivore diet is basically a keto diet, which I don't think is going to be the best place for somebody that wants to be doing resistance training and is training hard. And, performance is something that they're really concerned about. I don't think, I'm a person that's like, oh, keto's not really long term. But I do actually, from a scientific perspective, I like the idea of, okay, if we look at plants and we look at, the hormetic effect that we get from plants, is that because it's a positive or is that because we're responding to a negative or whatnot? And, there's a difference between something having a nutritional benefit versus, well, we see this upregulation in these anti-inflammatory compounds, but that could be just because the thing that we're eating is inflammatory or whatnot. So I like the whole idea of using more of an environmental hormesis rather than a nutritional hormesis. And so jumping down that rabbit hole of like, all right, let me go to low residue plants. So I'm basically eating like fruits and starches and meat. And that's kind of essentially my diet. So it's allowing me to have, we'll say, an athlete macro type of diet. But most of my plant, like basically almost all of my plant stuff is fruit based. It's all stuff that would be, we'll say relatively low residue. So, by the carnivore terms, they call them toxic. I don't know if that's the right word or whatnot, but I'm essentially getting my nutritional value from meats, organs, some basic supplementation like, vitamin D, multi, magnesium, electrolytes. And then I'm just relying on the organ meats and the fruit, for the bulk of my, we'll say micronutrients.
And yogurt.
Oh yeah, and yogurt. Yep. So can't forget the yogurt, because that's how I do my post workout. It's yogurt, whey protein, and bananas. And that's awesome. And so instead of a shake, I have a like a post workout banana porridge.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about starches, which ones are you? There's some that you don't ingest? Like, is it mostly rice, potatoes, corn, flour, like all of them or some of them?
Yes, so it's mainly white rice and potato, and some tapioca. Basically, I'm trying to find, like in this case, it's like I want refined, like I don't want whole grain, right? You know, because I don't want the husk or the hull or any of that stuff for this purpose of like trying to make it like it's like I just want the glucose polymers and nothing else, you know. So basically, you want almost the more refined. So the white rice is better than a brown rice in this particular scenario when this is the goal, right? And it's like, okay, for potato, like I do a lot of like mashed potato, right? So I get a lot of dehydrated potato flakes. That way I don't have to deal with the skin and stuff like that. So it's an interesting approach that, you know, probably is, I would say, very different because earlier in my, you know, my education in terms of nutrition, it was always like, okay, you got to eat all your greens and whatnot. And I went through that period of like, well, okay, now you're not just eating your greens, but you're also just drinking, you're also drinking greens on top of that, and you're hitting your fiber goal and all this stuff. And now I'm completely on the opposite side of the coin where it's just like, okay, maybe fiber isn't is so much of an issue. Maybe you don't need to eat all of these vegetables or whatever. Maybe a lot of what you need to eat is contextually, you know, relevant to, or I should say, should be contextual to how you're eating. Meaning that, like, okay, say for example, we talk about gut flora, and everybody talks about, well, you need these types of bacteria in your gut, and it's like, well, maybe that just depends on I need the right type of, you know, gut flora for the diet that I'm eating. So if I'm eating more like this, I don't need the same flora than if I was eating a much more fibrous diet, right? And I think that's what the research is going. And you know, I don't think it's black or white, like in terms of this, like, okay, plants are good, plants are bad. I just think, like, contextually, you know, finding what works for you. And that's essentially how I ended up where I'm at right now, is trying to find what worked for me. And to be honest, the best thing that happened in terms of me digestively was getting rid of plant residues. And all of the other things that I've tried, you know, whether that be like, you know, eating more paleo, going more gluten, high carb, low carb, you know, macro cycling, et cetera, all those things. One thing that's always been consistent, I think, for me is, you know, it's like, all right, when I get rid of things like, you know, that have plant oils, and unfortunately, a lot of pretty much everything processed has plant oils. Those seem to be the most offending things to my digestive system and my overall well-being. And this is just kind of taking that a little step further, right? But not going to like the keto extreme of a carnivore diet, right? Because I just, like I said, I just don't think that that's going to be good for most people that are doing weight training with any volume, frequency, intensity.
Agreed. Two quick follow-up questions here. I don't want to dwell too long on them, but it's just such a fascinating topic to talk about. Would you say with your history with vegetables, any of it was intolerance related? So is it like I had, when I would eat them, I just, one, maybe purely didn't like them, like you did briefly mention, or you had like digestive issues with them as well?
You know, it's been kind of a mix, and things have, you know, fluctuated. Like, I mean, I've done every type of, you know, everything from like a Leap MRT test to look at food intolerances to a Cyrex Labs and like all of those things at different points. You know, at one point in time, like lemon juice was a major, like, we'll say sensitivity for me, right? Like where it caused like almost an immediate digestive issue. But that was also at the time period where, you know, we were going through the phase of like, well, you had to drink lime or lemon water like when you woke up. Like that's what you just did. If you were in the fitness industry and you weren't drinking lime water, like you were, like, what were you doing? You weren't alkalizing properly, et cetera. So it's like, so I drank enough lime water to then make lime an issue. But now, you know, over time, it seems like, you know, with sensitivities and stuff, you just, you know, you tend to be more sensitive to the things that you're eating the most. And how sensitive you are just, I think, has to do with your overall health in terms of your gut lining and your inflammation in general. So it's been a mixture of both things. I mean, from a just like a pure taste perspective, like, you know, the only time I really enjoyed eating vegetables is when I drowned them in butter, which kind of defeats the point of eating the vegetables sometimes. Because it's like I used to love broccoli with butter, right? But like cruciferous vegetables would cause me more bloat, right? So, but I would eat them anyway because we associate them as being healthy, if that makes sense, right? But in terms of like the magnification of how much something impacted me, it would vary, and it's varied at different points in my life. But one of the things that's always been consistent, I think, you know, and this is just my personal anecdote kind of looking back at this, is things that had more of the vegetable oils in them, right?
Perfect.
More so than the fiber.
That was my kind of second follow-up. And then would you say with vegetable oils now, you avoid them across the board, like even extra virgin olive oil and like an avocado oil? Or is it just like your like sunflower oil, What's the big one that everyone always talks about that I can't think of?
Safflower.
Canola?
Canola.
Canola. Yeah.
Canola, yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the majority of my fats basically come from meat and dairy at this point in time, right? If I do use like a little bit of oil in a pan, it's avocado oil. Olive oil, it would be something I would use very sparingly. So basically, the majority of my fat intake just comes from meat. There's a small amount that comes from dairy. There's a sparing amount that maybe comes from avocado and olive oil, that sort of thing. Basically, that, and then that's kind of the extent there, right? So if I eat anything else, it's because I'm off plan, right? I'm eating a pizza or whatever or something like that. And that's the unfortunate thing is it's like it's easier to find something that is fat free, low carb, gluten free, like a million other things free, but not things that are, we'll say, free of vegetable oils or whatnot. Like basically, it's because it's about as that and wheat are basically that, wheat and corn. Those are like the three cheapest things that we can put in food. So pretty much, it's hard to find anything that's even remotely processed. So it's like good luck finding a treat that fits this type of diet, right? Like the one thing that I found for like, when if I'm going on hikes or whatnot, if I want to throw something in there that's not fruit, is like Rice Krispies, right? It's like I can find Rice Krispies that are basically like butter, rice, and sugar, So it's like, okay, cool. So that is on plan for me. Like maybe not from a macro perspective always, but I mean, if I'm hiking 8 miles, then I think I deserve a Rice Krispie treat. But that's maybe I'm biased.
It's totally
I wouldn't
justify
say
it.
you're biased in that. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for sharing all of that. I appreciate it. Cool. Well, let's jump into the things that we're all interested in, starting with kind of exercise variation. So with all of the focus that I hear you guys talk about with exercise selection and exercise execution, one thing I don't hear you guys talk about a lot is exercise variation, or more specifically, whether you even keep movements consistent week to week within a phase, like if you're in a hypertrophy phase or et cetera. Do you have these like trackable metrics where you're looking to see progressive overload week to week, and kind of what would be the reasons that you would change out movements within a phase?
Yeah, so we keep movements pretty much consistent throughout a phase. I would say if you look at our programming from more of a macro level, you would kind of see that our phases may be short. So I think that the easiest thing might be is if I could just kind of give you like a bird's eye view of like, well, what does an N1 program like macro cycle kind of look like? And so what we will do is we will rotate stimulus. So we'll say, okay, well, this program here is designed for this type of stimulus, whether we're chasing mechanical tension, whether we're focusing a little bit more on a metabolic stimulus to maybe get some adaptations for nutrient partitioning or more mitochondrial adaptations. So we kind of shift the target to be as specific as possible to a goal. And so let's say that you're running, you're going to do a 16-week hypertrophy block. If that makes sense to most people in terms of the nomenclature. What we would do probably instead of doing 16 weeks of the same program, right, is we might do 3 or 4 weeks of a mechanical tension program, and then we might throw in 1 or 2 weeks of something that was a little bit more metabolic. So basically that's like, okay, this phase here that we're throwing in here is to actually bring up recovery and nutrient partitioning, keep our, insulin sensitivity or, glycogen sensitivity, whatever you want to call it, right? But basically just get us to where we're like, okay, we're improving and maintaining our metabolic health, which is going to, improve everything from our ANS and whatnot. So it basically it keeps us from running into that recovery wall as we're progressing intensity and volume throughout the hypertrophy phase. So it might be like, okay, it's 3 to 4 weeks of mechanical tension and then a couple weeks of metabolic, and you would basically repeat that cycle, progressing both of them over the period of a longer macro cycle, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like you're alternating 2 smaller mesos to make a macro, if that kind of makes sense. And so within that, we would have exercise selection that would be specific to those 2 different goals. But within those, you would keep progressing those throughout that, right? So it's like, okay, you could be doing a hack squat throughout that whole thing, but during the metabolic one, we may either change the way we do the hack squat, or we might just use the leg extension or something that isn't necessarily going to have as much mechanical trauma or inflammation or things like that, so we can focus purely on that metabolic goal for that 1 or 2 weeks. So it serves as a nice deload, but also a potentiation for when you cycle back into that exercise. So from a progression standpoint, what we try and get people to do is, they're going to progress, as much as possible when they're doing those same exercises, and then when they take that break and come back in, the goal is it's like, well, okay, I'm either going to come in at the same or maybe one step back, right? But when I do the progression of, say, we'll say they're the second round of the mechanical tension phase, is that they will experience progressions faster than if they had just done like 8 weeks linearly, right? So the goal is to get the most net progression over that whole time and not just be limited on I just always have to be progressing week to week to week, but it's okay to step out and then come back on if that gives you a greater rate of progress over the whole macro cycle. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. So using that hack squat example, like you might build that progressively over the course of a 4 week period. Then you jump into like a 2 week metabolite phase. You do some maybe IRM stuff, which is like, for
Mm-hmm.
the listener, it's like sets of eight, 6 sets of 8 with 30 seconds rest in between, something like that. You generally want to do those with a short overload movement, right? So you wouldn't want to do
Mm-hmm.
6 sets of 8 on a hack squat. So you dump that hack squat, you prioritize the leg extension for 2 weeks, and then you come back and you, like you said, maybe take a step back on the hack squat, but eventually you end up a few steps forward at the end of that next 4 week block.
Yep. So, and I find that that's a very, we'll say it's not only would I find it efficient more over the long term, but one of the things that we find is it actually helps with the week to week progression. So as long as you're okay taking that one minor step back when you like re-enter that exercise like week one, that you actually see like it's just like from a motivational perspective, you're progressing faster on a week to week, and we find that that tends to help people like mentally as well. In terms of staying motivated and wanting to or not just being consistent and being compliant with that, because it's like, well, it's exciting if I'm making faster progress week to week. It becomes a lot less exciting when you're like fighting for like a percent of a percent of a percent, of an improvement, right?
Yeah, I mean the psychological toll is huge. That's always the one thing I always butted up against with mesocycles, where it's like, every week you're like RPE 9 to 10, and then the next week it's like, okay, we're gonna add some weight and go 9 to 10 again, and then maybe it's like 2 pounds and you're still at RPE 9 to 10, and every week you're like, fuck, I have to go deeper and deeper into this hack squat or pendulum or whatever it is. So I'm a huge fan of that style as well. It's almost like when you come out of a deload week and you have like you have an intro week before you start ramping things up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
I had one other follow up on that. So you guys also have the neural phase thing, which is more of like a strength period. And so you were saying kind of you go like maybe 4 weeks of mechanical tension hypertrophy focus, then you would jump out and do maybe like 2 weeks of metabolic, and then jump back into hypertrophy. What are kind of the signs that you look for as to A, when it's time for a metabolic phase, and B, when it's time for a neural phase? Like, how do you kind of determine which one is due up in the sequence?
So first I'll say, so we have basically, think of it as just like three main categories. We call them hypertrophy, neuro, and metabolic, right? But within each of those, there's a ton of subcategories that can be very differentiated. Because, for instance, from a metabolic phase, we could be focusing more on systemic, which is where we're going to be doing things like upper, lower body supersets, like basically the type of workout where your heart rate is staying through the roof the whole time, right? And you're working a high volume of tissue, but it's a low volume per tissue, right? So it's like I'm working a lot of muscles, but not a lot of volume per individual muscles to create a large systemic demand, versus what you're doing with the RARM, which is completely opposite, where it's like I'm trying to metabolically tax a very specific tissue, right, and really just stress it. So one of those is trying to get more of a local adaptation, another is trying to get a more global adaptation. And so what we're trying to look at when somebody's doing, they're doing one of their hypertrophy blocks, is we're trying to figure out which one of those would potentiate their recovery or their performance more, right? So basically, we can use things like HRV. We can use things of like, well, how well are people recovering between sets? What's their resting heart rate, their morning heart rate? All of these things. How is their sleep? If it's bad, how is it bad? Is it waking up? Is it not falling asleep? Not staying asleep, etc. As we look at those things, we're like, okay, what type of physiological adaptations would be better to put in that would improve likely your recovery and improve your performance. So, for instance, if you have somebody and their heart rate recovery is just fine, but they have a hard time recovering, for the same muscle group being trained over and over again, we might be like, okay, we probably need to focus more on improving that system from a local perspective metabolically. Like it's like, okay, you need better mitochondrial health in that muscle. We need better vascular and glycogen adaptations in that muscle tissue. So we might go for it locally. But if you're the person where it's just like, man, the limiting factor for me on leg day is I'm just gassed like the whole workout if I'm actually doing hard lifts. It's like, well, in that instance, maybe we should actually do something systemic. So we're actually doing something that's going to be challenging the cardiovascular system more, right? And then that will improve your performance. And then the same thing from a recovery standpoint, because a lot of times, people don't realize that, hypertrophy is an energy demanding process. Like growing muscle costs calories, it costs macronutrients. And so the better you are at making energy, the better you are at recovery. And I think that gets lost on a lot of people that are just like, oh, cardio is for weight loss or whatever it is, right? And we don't realize like actually when you're just trying to recover from a workout and you're trying to turn all those processes, the faster that your body can go from, an energy deficit, not calorie deficit, but an energy deficit to like, okay, now all of my cells are good. They're, all their ATP pools are full, their glycogen, like the faster that you can get back to that, the faster they can be like, cool, now we can afford to spend energy and nutrients on extra things like building your biceps, and doing that process. So I think, when we see people and they're stagnating in terms of a results perspective, a lot of times it's like, well, grinding away at the same process and just trying to do that harder, that's like the definition of an inefficient pursuit, right? It's like, don't do more of the thing that's giving you the smallest ROI, right? Figure out, well, what could I do that would allow me to get the ROI out of, or greater ROI out of less? And so the combination of deloading and then emphasizing like, okay, if we make you better at getting carbohydrates where we want them to go and creating energy, then I know your performance is going to be better, and I know your ability to recover is going to be better because I'm going to need less, I'm going to need less time to initiate that recovery phase. And the other thing is it also decreases our threshold for when we go from, say, like an anabolic to a catabolic state, if we want to say that very plainly. It's not very nuanced, but very plainly, because if you're out of shape and you go up a set of stairs, that can shift your body chemistry, because it can be like, oh, wow, this is a really physically demanding task. I better mobilize, some carbohydrates and some fats into the blood, right? I better raise cortisol up a little bit. My nervous system gets a little bit more out of shape. But if I'm in really good shape and I walk up the set of stairs and my body's like, yeah, that's nothing. Just use the little fats that are in the blood. No big deal. We're not going to raise cortisol. We're not going to dump blood sugar, all that, right? Then basically I can be in a quasi more anabolic state during higher threshold activities, right? Whereas somebody that's out of shape, walking around the mall might prevent them from running protein synthesis, but somebody that's in great shape, could be doing a casual recreational activity and it's not impacting their recovery.
Aaron, any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, I mean, it was you took something that I kind of understood from like a conceptual, but not quite deep enough, and explained it so well. And it's some of those things like, okay, we want to train, right? Our goal is hypertrophy, but we can, like you said, slave away, maybe make half percent increases, or we can take some detours to really like help us leapfrog forward in some of these limiting aspects from other environmental factors, like primarily recovery, right, and then energy availability and utility. So fantastically explained.
Yeah, hypertrophy is the sport of over-recovering,
Yes.
right? That's the best way to put it.
I love that. I tell people that all the time when they're always like, why am I only training 4 days a week? I'm like, because you need to recover. So anyway, regarding deloads, you guys, from what I understand, you mostly use this kind of change in stimulus and you jump into these systemic local blocks or neural phases. Do you ever take like a true deload in the style that like you're cutting volume and proximity to failure and really kind of flushing this fatigue in from like a global sense?
Yeah, and so what you need to do in a deload depends on what you need to deload from, right? I mean, so really, the more specific you are in your training, then the more specific you can be in your deload. And that's one of the things I like about having kind of a more stimulus-orientated, approach rather than, say, like a kitchen sink where it's like you got a program where you're trying to do a whole bunch of things at once, like you're doing some heavy things and some light things and whatever. Then it's like, well, I don't know what aspects of this training program are really causing or overburdening my system, right? And so I don't know what I need to decrease for it to be able to recover. So I just have to decrease everything. So there are instances where you need to do that because some things, like some hypertrophy programs where you're just getting a sheer amount of volume, volume is one of those things that just taxes every system. Like if you do enough volume, yeah, it's metabolically taxing, it's neurologically taxing. Like it's you do enough and it just taxes everything. So there are instances where we will do that, and that's usually when we're working with those people that are really having to push a ton of volume in that particular stimulus. And basically volume just means that, like, man, no matter, it's like okay, if you shoot a shotgun at a target, right, one time, it hits all over the target, right? But if I take a sniper rifle and I shoot, but I shoot it 100 times, I'm still might shoot all over that target, right? So volume basically still ends up hitting everything in terms of stress. So, we got to recover from that. But if we're not overburdening somebody with volume too much, then we may not need to take a deload to the point where this is like, okay, we're not really achieving anything weak. I'm like, man, wouldn't it be so awesome if, like, instead of having a week or 2 weeks where you just tried to maintain, right, or you tried to limit how far you went backwards while you just let your body recover, what if we could actually improve in another area? And so that's where we try and make people more efficient in the 52 weeks of the year. Is it's like, okay, if there is the opportunity, why don't we capitalize on that during your deload rather than just saying, hey, we're going to do the same thing that you've been doing, but we're just going to do it less good. Right? Because it's like, well, okay, obviously that's not going to, I mean, the benefit that you get during the deload all comes from the prior weeks, right? Mm-hmm. It's the super compensation effect, right? You don't make the progress in the deload from the stimulus of the deload. You're just recovering from the prior stimulus. And so it's like, okay, it's kind of a like maintenance-y thing. And it's like, what if we could have more? Mm-hmm. What if we could just be progressing the whole year, but we're just not always focusing on progressing the same thing, right? So that kind of fits in our undulation of, like, swapping around with different stimulus, et cetera. And I just find that, one, that's more efficient. And I also think that, from a psychological standpoint, the fact that you get to, like, throw in, training modalities that somebody wouldn't otherwise use, there's an entertainment value, but there's also just like a general health value of, dare I say it, being more CrossFit without actually doing, CrossFit type training. But it's like you're more fit across different stimuli, different demands, right? Because then it's like, okay, cool. Like, I'm a power lifter. I want to bench, X amount of weight or whatever. But if a couple times a year I do like a German, body comp style training thing where I'm doing all of these lifts, in a circuit or whatever, that might massively improve that person's cardiovascular health, right? And it might improve their blood flow, and it might improve their recovery, and all sorts of things for them. And they don't necessarily have to take like, well, okay, I'm going to take an 8-week meso of, metabolic training. It's just like, oh, I just tick those boxes occasionally when I need them, so that I'm adapted in those in proportion to what I need for my goal and my lifestyle.
No, I love that approach. That philosophy is great. One quick follow up on the deload. Do you ever advise people just taking time off, like 4 to 7 days a year, twice a year, something like that?
Yeah. So I'd say, like, if you look at a year cycle, the majority of our deloads are going to be just a change in stimulus, right? And then there's going to be a small amount where we're going to drastically decrease, like, volume to where it's like more of a traditional deload. And then even less frequently than that would be like, okay, this person may need just like, period off. And again, it's all contextual, right? Like, if you're not pressing the gas that hard, chances are you won't put yourself in a situation where you need to slam on the brake. Right? But if you're pushing the pedal harder, then likely you're going to come into an instance where you have to apply the brake harder at some point in time. So whether or not somebody needs to get there and when they need to get there really just depends on how much they've been pushing things. And, and then sometimes it's just logistically convenient, right? And that's where it's like, maybe you do like planned overtraining or whatever, because somebody wants to, like, hey, I'm going to go on a vacation and, I don't want to worry about having to hit the gym or whatever. So why don't we just do something now? So basically, as long as I'm walking around, I just, instead of drinking at the bar that's at my pool, I go one pool over and get my drinks and get my steps in that way. That'll be enough that I don't come back a total slob after vacation or whatever it is, for that person. I'm just like, hey, sometimes if we know like what's going to fit that person's lifestyle better, then we can be like, hey, we can plan the training so that we can make this deload fit in with your lifestyle better.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Aaron, any thoughts?
No, I mean, I love that approach, like ramping up, overreaching a little bit with coinciding with lifestyle vacation type of thing. It's a very novel thing for me hearing, and I just think it's a fantastic approach.
Yeah, especially because you tend to travel, take a week off twice a year just through like relocation. And so now maybe you can use it as an opportunity to slightly overreach and then kind of super compensate.
Yeah,
I
it
think
is
that's
a
it. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was saying it is a great idea. I'm just thinking about it in like practicality though, depending on how we're doing it, right? If it's like 2 days spent driving 12 hours a day in the car going somewhere,
Yeah,
probably
probably
not for
not.
the best.
Yeah, like
But
deadlifts to failure
yeah,
the day before and then sit in a car.
yeah. But it is a pretty cool idea. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a huge placebo for it too, because a lot of times when people go, like, if when they do take time off, they may feel guilty. So if you can help them just have a better mental outlook about taking that time off, a lot of times there's your win right there, right? Or they're just expecting like, oh, I'm doing this overreaching thing, so now I need this time off, or whatever it is. That might be good, because you occasionally, like, I might throw that in there for that neurotic person that like refuses to take a break, and I'm like, hey, I'm going to help out your relationship a little bit here by enforcing you to take a break, by saying, oh, we did this, so you have to do that now. It's part of the programming. And so I think there can be, we'll say, some placebo benefits to this that are oftentimes overlooked by people that are just looking like really into like, oh, what's the physiological? Is there research that says that if I do this, that I will gain 6% more hypertrophy or whatever? And like, but what if you just like it better?
Right, right.
Right.
That definitely plays an effect for sure. Cool. So earlier you mentioned, what is the funnel or whatever that's keeping this person from progressing, and you were using the example of somebody that is huffing and puffing through a hypertrophy phase and resting excessively between sets, and like that person really needs to have a systemic conditioning phase. How do we know that the rest periods we're using are too long? This has been a topic of conversation recently. I just posted on my Instagram yesterday about it, and then Aaron and I were kind of going back and forth about it, but I always kind of err on the side of just resting a lot, because I want, to make sure my performance stays high, and I want to make sure I'm, mentally and physically prepared for each set. So like something like a lower body compound movement, like I said, a pendulum to an RPE 8 or 9, I might rest, 5 minutes before I do my next pendulum set. Like between single leg squats, 2 or 3 minutes between each leg type thing. Like, would you look at that and say, oh, this dude needs better condition immediately, like put him into a metabolic phase, or like how do we assess that and make sense of it?
That's going to be a complex one to answer generally, because it really kind of depends on an individual, right? Because one person's 3 minutes is another person's 5, because the heavier loads you're doing, the more body mass you have, all of those things come into like, okay, where do you sit proportionally on how much rest that you need, right? Like one of the things that I learned way back in the day taking course with Charles Poliquin, who is one of the best strength coaches, in history, was just like, hey, the bigger and stronger you are, the more rest you deserve,
Yeah.
right? And and that definitely plays out practically, right? And also the more trained you are, et cetera, right? So, but there's a balance of like, okay, if I'm a trained individual, but I'm also more conditioned, do those two things cancel each other out a little bit, right? So the thing that I try and focus on is, throughout the workout, is the perceived fatigue, ascending at the rate that you would want, right? Or are you, increasing fatigue and crashing in performance at a greater rate than what you would want, right? Now, you could get in, look at things. It's like, all right, instead of just like performance, how long does it take for my heart rate to come back down? I mean, okay, that tells me the cardiovascular aspect of it, but it doesn't tell me anything about the neurological aspect of it, right? Or necessarily like an energy system perspective. Like there could be things that, are more nuanced than that. So you could be like, okay, if they're just gassed too long, maybe it's cardiovascular shape. And one thing you can always do is it's like, okay, why don't we just try, doing something that's cardiovascularly challenging? And if you suck at it, well, then that probably means you're not very good in that area.
Yeah.
So we could work on that, right? So if like walking at a 4-degree incline is getting your heart rate up, higher than when you're doing your squat workout, then maybe that could be a limiter in terms of how much rest we need, et cetera. But I would say if you have somebody and you're not suspecting that they're extremely deconditioned and we're trying to just, fine tune those rest intervals, is I'm looking at, okay, what do I want we'll say like the RPE climb. So typically the way that we do most of our training, like, is we use like an ascending RPE, meaning that like your first set is, going to be at a lower RPE, higher RIR, and then you're working towards, sets that are getting closer to failure, right? And you could be combining that with either more reps, heavier loads, combination of the two, whatever it may be. So it's like, okay, if I feel like, I'm hitting the wall too early, comparative to last time or whatever, then I'd be like, okay, then that's probably a sign that now at these loads or, at whatever these training variables are, I need to bring that rest up a little bit, right? And then you try that out. But if you do that and you don't see any increase in performance, right? You're not able to progressively overload anymore by adding the rest, then I'd say you might be past the point of diminishing returns of continuing to add rest, right? And I think one thing to take in mind is that if you're doing this in strength training, because there's much more of a neurological demand if we're doing really low reps versus hypertrophy, right? Is it's make sure you maintain that context of what's most important, right? So, because it's like, man, if I lose one rep, in a hypertrophy rep range, I got 11 instead of 12 or whatever it may be. But in order to get that 12th rep, it takes me like another minute or two. I have to then weigh the cost benefits of that in terms of the length of the session and how I organize things or whatever. Because it's like, okay, now if I'm doing sets of, 4 and I lose a rep, that's 25% of my set. Right. So then maybe that 2 minutes, my set was only like, 4 seconds. Right. So, so adding another 2 minutes, not that big deal because my sets only take like 2 minutes for the whole workout. So then maybe it's worth it because by taking that 2 minutes, I get 25% more volume out of that set, from a rep count variable. Right. But if I'm like, I have to rest basically 50% more to get 8% more. Is that really going to be the efficient way to do this? Or what if I could just like add another set, So those are the things that we need to like look at comparing, right? Because, the research is like, oh yeah, 3 minutes seems to be a good marker, but we don't have we don't have anything that compares like, well, what if somebody did, 2.5 minutes and then got one more set, in that same time frame, right? And then like, well, okay, instead of 3 minutes between these exercises or 5 minutes between these exercises, what if I do antagonist pairings or whatever, and I use half that rest time between those? So it's like I'm getting a higher volume of work, or maybe I even use a little bit longer. So technically it's like I'm actually getting maybe say 25, 50% more rest between repeating the same exercise, but I'm getting another exercise in there. So from a time perspective, that's more efficient. And I try to utilize those strategies because the goal is to be able to progressively overload, right? And to be able to maintain that performance and get that fatigue climb where you want it without having to make your workouts like 2 hours long, right? So you got to be strategic if you want to add those rest intervals, unless you happen to be a person that just like, oh, I have nothing but time, right? So, which is a very, like, basically it's a very, very small percentage of people or clientele. And then even those that are, like me personally, like if I wanted to, I could like, hey guys, I'm going to partition, 2 hours a day for my training sessions, right? But I would be going insane if I was just like resting 5 minutes between sets all the time. Right. It'd be like, no, I gotta do 2 exercises or, so, like I got to find a way to make this better, right? Or otherwise I'm going to be fighting with people on Instagram in between sets. And I'm sure that does not promote performance, right?
Yeah, no, I love that context. The whole thing you laid out right at the end of like, if I'm doing say 3 sets with a 3-minute rest and maybe with a 2.5-minute rest, I can get a 4th set in. Like that's literally like kind of the root of the thing Aaron and I were talking about is that more beneficial? Like maybe I lose a rep on a set because I'm resting 30 seconds shorter, but now I get an extra set in. Like, what's the opportunity cost there,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and I don't think that we can say that that's going to be one way or another without taking an individual into account, right?
Yeah.
I think that decision is going to have to be made on an individual level.
Yeah, one thing I really like you said there too. I mean, like everything we're talking about, right? It is all contextually dependent. But for someone who might be like a little bit more like cardiovascular adapted, they might be able to take that shorter rest period, you know what I mean? And then still get those extra reps. But if you're someone who maybe needs to go through, right, a metabolic phase or whatever to increase that, you can take the opposite approach. We rest a little bit longer to ensure you're still getting the appropriate, volume that you're trying to get for your goal there.
Yeah, if I add one more caveat, because I know one person will that if he watches this will make this comment or whatever. It's just like, okay, so there's metabolic and neurological limitations, right, that are going to dictate like how much you can rest, right? And so we can improve the metabolic portion of it like fairly well, but we can't change the neurological component that much, right? Which is why rep ranges and things like that and exercise selection are going to kind of dictate this a little bit, right? Because we can't force the nervous system to recover faster the way that we can the metabolic system. Now that's not true because we do get adaptations in the nervous system, so it's not that the nervous system can't improve at all, but it's just our ability to move that needle, like we can nudge that. But from a metabolic perspective, like we can take somebody from, a gross position of deconditioning to being in, very conditioned, right? And having a really high metabolic capacity.
Yep. Aaron, thoughts?
No, just agreeing there
Cool.
for sure. I mean, I can tell that just from different periods of myself. Like when I was transitioning, back into hypertrophy training, was doing like sets of 12 and stuff on legs. Like I was an absolute mess, and now that's just Tuesday.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, the work capacity thing is weird because from our background in CrossFit, I felt like, or I know for sure that work capacity was always my limiting factor in CrossFit. Like it was never like my creatine phosphate system or anything along those lines or skills. It was always work capacity. And I felt like no matter what, I just never got better at it. Like I got better at pacing, so my scores got better, but I didn't actually feel like I got in better shape. And so I guess you could say that I'm a little bit unsure of how much I would respond to a metabolic phase, but I guess I won't know till I try. So very interesting stuff. What do you think on work capacity? How much do you see it kind of, how much can people adapt in a way?
Well, you can adapt a lot, but the question is at what cost, right? So if you take yourself, for example, right, it's like, well, could that be an area that you could improve significantly? Well, I would say yes, you could, but the question is, are you going to start losing some of those other adaptations because of how far you need to go in the other direction to move that needle, right? And so this is where like an individual's genetics really come into play in terms of the things that you're naturally gifted for and stuff like that, right? Because you just can't be good at everything all at once, right? You can get better at everything, but sometimes getting better at one speciality comes at the sacrifice of not being as good at the other thing. And so that is the challenge of CrossFit, is you're trying to figure out the balance of, what qualities that you need to get the best of those scores, right? And it's like, well, okay, if your work capacity went up, but then your load capacity went down, is that going to ultimately get you a net positive, in that challenge or not, right? This is the same thing that I go with when I talk about people that are training fighters for MMA and they're doing the strength and conditioning aspect of it. It's like, look, you can't just think of like, oh, I'm just going to get this person in better shape. It's like, no, what you need to do is you need to figure out what shape they need to be in to best go with their skill and fighting style, right? Because if you got a really, kind of slow-paced guy that just likes to, that wants to grind out the clock or whatever, that person needs different adaptations than somebody that's like, no, I like to walk out of the ring in 2 minutes. Like that's my goal, right? And so I think it's important to look at. It's like, all right, how you choose to either improve your work capacity or improve your strength or your speed, whatever qualities you want to work on, is that you want to make sure that you're doing them in context of what the overall goal is, and you're not just thinking like, well, I just need to make all of these things better, and taking the Rudy approach of like, well, I'm just going to find the worst thing and just make that better. But it's like, no, actually, for you, that worst thing might be best if that is the worst thing, because these other things are a higher priority, right? And so you take, for instance, if we imagine instead of Brian was doing CrossFit, that he was an Anderson Silva, right? He was like one of the best strikers in MMA history, and like basically you win fights off of your explosive technique, and so pacing in between those explosive bouts is a better strategy than trying to turn you into a marathon runner and then all of a sudden you lose that explosive skill, right? Or it diminishes or whatnot, right? So you see that, I see that a lot. And we'll see physique athletes that all of a sudden have a health issue, and then they like, oh, okay, now I'm gonna pay attention, I'm gonna work on these things, but then all of a sudden they just make those things the priority, and then all of a sudden they are no longer successful at their sport. And it's like, okay, you didn't need to completely do a 180, you just needed to not completely neglect this other thing. It just needed to be good enough, right? And I see it in fighters all the time too, where they will make they'll gas out in one fight, or something will happen, and then they're just like, okay, I'm just going to be the cardio machine, and they're just going to assume that all of their other skills are going to be exactly the way they were if they partition all their time to something different, and that's not the way it works, right? Like the things that make you good, likely that's because of what you're doing now, and if you're taking away from that to do something else, you have to decide, is that a net positive for your goal?
No, that's really well put. And to be fair, I was always scared to do that in CrossFit too. Like I never dedicated to just a strictly work capacity phase. I always had that other stuff in there because it was like so important to my identity to be good at that stuff. So I don't know what my adaptation would have been to work capacity had I kind of neglected some of the other stuff. So either way, we're here now, so it doesn't really matter in the long run. Aaron, anything real quick before I move on here?
No, I was just going to add a quick note around my work capacity sucked because I didn't want to get better at it because it hurt too much.
Yeah. Yep. The systemic cycles that you guys do, I guess an example would be like back squat, row, chest press, something like that. You would probably do those with 15 seconds rest between or something along those lines. That reminds me of CrossFit.
Yeah, well, we won't do them with 15 seconds. Like usually in that scenario, we will do them with like a minute or something like that.
It's still
right?
the fatigue catches up.
Yeah. At 15 seconds, you're not weight training anymore. You're just doing like aerobic work with a mild resistance. So the goal for like if we're doing a systemic thing is it's like, all right, we're trying to make sure that we're using enough intensity that we're going to at least maintain muscle, right? Like we're not switching from like resistance training to choreographs with metal, right? We're not dancing with the weights now at this point in time. So it's got to be high enough intensity, right? So that we're still getting a muscular challenge, but also dense enough between those other things that it is systemically challenging, which, if you've I don't know what your population of people that you work with is, but one of the things that you'll find out about systemic training is that if you put a beginner on one of those workouts, like it might be hard for them, especially if they're really out of shape, but they survive. It might suck, maybe they'll even throw up or whatever, but they survive and they get better really fast to the point where then it's like, man, you're throwing stuff at them that you're like, if I did that as an experienced trainee with this muscle mass, like if I did what they were doing right now, I would be dead. Like I would just be laying on the floor dead. And that's because as you get more muscle mass and you actually get stronger, it's like, a shorter rest for somebody that has a lot of muscle mass and is strong might be 90 seconds, right? But for somebody that has no neurological efficiency, they can't really make use of their tissue, they don't have that much muscle mass, whatever, they might be the person that's like, yeah, I can do, squats and rows back to back with like 30 seconds, and be just fine, right? Yep. But if you did that, you'd have to use like the bar, or you'd just be like laying on the ground panting.
Yeah.
And so it's like the amount of rest in the number of exercises and all that stuff is very individual dependent, right? Because density, think of it this way, is it's like you're trying to work, if you think of if you could just pull the muscle mass that you're working that day out of somebody and put it on a scale, and it's like, okay, we're working like 60 pounds of beef today, out of this person, right? And it's like, okay, it's the density in relationship to just the mass of tissue that is doing that work, right? And how well you work that massive tissue. So if you either don't use that tissue very well, or you don't have that much, right, then you use a lot more density. But if you have a lot more tissue, then the respective density can come down, right? Because what you'll see is like well-trained athletes will just get crushed on a program that a general population person might just skate through. Yep. Right, and give you a fist bump at the end, and like your well-seasoned athlete is like it's like asking you to call the ambulance after the same workout. Yep. Right, big difference.
I've seen that a ton across different clients in the CrossFit community too. I mean, the stronger you are and the closer you can push, the deeper you can take that thing. So 100% relate to that. Cool. So I am extremely curious about some of your perspective on building specialization cycles. And I've heard you say, and I agree, that execution comes first. So before you even begin to design a specialization cycle for someone, you want to make sure that the execution in the movement or muscle area that they're trying to target is, in fact, on point. So assuming that we have an athlete that you've kind of said it, is right on track, they're performing it properly, would you manipulate frequency first, volume first? How would you just generally approach the design of a specialization cycle?
So when it is somebody that needs to work on the technique, I will go for frequency because it's better to learn technique at less fatigue, right? But when it's somebody that, that's not the issue, then I'm probably going to look and make sure that we're hitting that volume mark per session, right? Because it doesn't do me any good to have 2 sessions a week if I'm not reaching basically the threshold to get a significant stimulus out of those. So before I do 2 of something, I need to make sure 1 of something is good, right? So it's like, okay, if exercise selection and exercise technique are good, then I'm actually going to just work on either progressing volume, whether that be, using more exercises to cover more of the muscles, going closer to fatigue, adding sets, like lots of different ways that would all be individual dependent, right? But I'm going to make sure we're getting enough out of the session before I then say, hey, let's do this twice, right? Now, I know there's plenty of research that will say like, well, okay, if we're looking at untrained or moderately trained individuals, then maybe like if they're doing 15 sets a week, they could do that at 555 and get the same benefit as somebody else or whatever. And I think that's probably the case in those people because the threshold for their individual session is low. But as you get to more advanced, that threshold goes up, right? So I would make sure we're doing enough volume per session before I would say, hey, let's go there. If anything, what we technically do is that we're kind of like, we undulate this kind of stuff as well, right? Meaning that we will have a phase where we're trying to drive up volume per session, right? And then we will have another phase where we're trying to spread that out, which will then hopefully somewhat deload the volume we need per session a bit, right? So it's like, but both of those things they're gonna creep up eventually, right? And there's also just logistics, right? So if you have somebody and they're currently doing, 6 sets of a body part, right? If you were to say, okay, well, what's going to be more efficient if I say, hey, we're going to do 4 and 4, right? Or if we're going to go up to 7 or 8 in an individual workout, right? And at that point, it's like, man, do I really want to take them all the way down to 4 sets to be able to split this up and make that a reasonable progression? So basically, it's much more easy to split 15 sets than it is 6 sets or 8 sets. So when basically is the higher volume that you get, then the more beneficial it becomes to start spreading it out. But when you don't have a lot of volume to work with, then it's like, okay, it's like I'm going to split a banana between the 3 of us, right? But then you go and you see 2 other people and you're like, now I'm going to split this third of a banana into you 3 or whatever. And by the time you do that, then like everybody's only getting like a lick of the banana, right? And nobody's going to benefit from the banana. So same thing. If we have a big thing that we can divide up into 3 pieces, that's great. But a little thing divided up into 3 pieces ends up being not practical or beneficial.
That's interesting. I relate. I want to use a example of myself and get some thoughts. So a couple weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, I went up to Fort Collins and trained with Nunez and Miner and had them give me like a physique assessment of sort. Like I was pretty lean. I was like 183 pounds and had them tell me, what are my weak body parts? What should I be focusing on, this next year? And they, without a doubt, were talking about my hamstrings. And so immediately in my mind, the first thing I think of is, well, shit, my hamstrings take so much damage. Like I literally do 2 sets of RDLs and 2 sets of leg curls and I'm sore for 3 or 4 days. So how do I build myself a specialization cycle, right? And so when it comes to a muscle group like the hamstrings that does take damage at that level, what are kind of some of the tools you might use to be able to still accrue more volume there? Is it the use of like more short overload movements, less of like the hip hinging and RDLs, or kind of what are your thoughts there?
Yeah. So you're already kind of on the right path here and thinking like, okay, is it just is it just that stretch in the RDL that's beating me up so bad, and I could add more volume if I just did it in something different, right? So there is that instance. So you could try and find a way to be able to increase your frequency by just, using exercises that don't have that quality where they're going to provide that soreness that is going to negatively impact frequency. Or you could be like, well, I know that if I train like this, that it puts me out for this much, so my frequency isn't going to go up. So what if I try just making a massive hamstring effort upper, workout, and seeing if that actually got me more progress? Because the soreness isn't necessarily a correlative magnitude to the stimulus, right? So it could be like, hey,
Novel.
I'm going to be sore just because I'm doing this exercise in this stretch position, and I know that's how my body responds to it, right? But knowing that I'm going to be that sore, if I try putting more stimulus in there, I might still, it takes me the same amount of days to recover, right? I mean, maybe it's a little bit more uncomfortable for a couple of those days, but if it's still, hey, it takes, after 5 days, I'm good. Like regardless, like if I do 2 sets, if I do 6 sets or whatever, it's just if I do RDLs, I need 5 days, right? Then it might be like, well, hell, if we're going to do it, let's frickin' do it then, right? Why don't we make sure that like we capitalize on that as much as possible? So you could basically look at 2 approaches of that, right? And since you get affected by such a small volume of that, and I would say, well, but an exercise like that is a really, that's something that we would associate as really good for hypertrophy, then it might be like, that might be the way to do it. Or it could be, hey, maybe then you're just going to do a ton of, leg curls and maybe the 45 extension or something that doesn't overload that lengthened position, quite as much. Or maybe it's like, okay, instead of, doing the RDLs, maybe I skimp on the range of motion, dare I say it, right? Or whatever, right? Now, I would say probably what I would lean more towards is either just trying to add in more exercises on a different day that I know I would recover faster from, or saying, hey, if I know incorporating these exercises that do work for me, but they just put me out, it's like, let's see how much volume. Let's RP or Mike Israetel the crap out of my hamstrings, and let's just keep adding sets, right, until I think it's unproductive, as long as it's not extending the length of the soreness, right? It's okay, if you're more sore, that's fine, but if you're sore for longer, then that might negatively impact the training. But it's like, okay, let's just see what happens and see how well you progress there, right? Because there will be, like, some people will just they'll have those exercises or they'll have those movements, and likely that is, it's like, yeah, you're just getting a lot more of that stretch reflex. The other thing is, the SAID principle, right? Maybe the way to overcome that is simply to actually challenge that, right? So maybe the reason that you get sore from doing 2 sets of RDLs is because you've never done 8 sets of RDLs.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. I actually think,
right?
The idea you put out as well of adding volume to the session and just seeing if that extends the soreness, that's a really interesting idea, because I've been kind of timid to do that. Like I'll go to 4 or 5 sets, and then I'm like, ooh, I'm sore for 3 days. I probably shouldn't do anymore. So I actually like that, and then I like the idea of the volume ramping, like taking the Israetel and just kind of, as you adapt, you get less sore. So maybe that's an idea too, like starting with 4 sets and then 5 the next week and 6 the next week and 7, and just kind of see where the bottleneck is on there. So that's awesome. I appreciate all that input.
Yeah, you might find if you bring your tolerance up to like, if you just like, hey, now I'm doing this just like sickening hamstring workout, right? Now if I go down to what would be more reasonable, maybe you would find that, oh, now I actually do recover in 2 days, right? So, but until you really push that adaptation, then you're not going to know. It's like the same thing with your work capacity that you were talking about, right? So if you never attack it directly, you don't really know how much better, what type of adaptations you could get that in, right? Because you're always just kind of like meandering it along.
Absolutely, yeah. Aaron, what kind of thoughts do you have on all that?
I do have a little bit of a follow-up question to the volume before splitting it. So the one thing you said, just to kind of recap, is with splitting your volume, if your total volume is too low, splitting it, across 2 or 3 or 2 or more sessions, I should say, you might not really reach that minimum threshold you want per session. So I know it's obviously kind of a hard question to answer, and it's obviously contextually dependent, but about where might you say is an appropriate level for that threshold for a single session for volume of a body part?
Yeah, so I think absolute minimum is probably going to be 4 sets, but probably a more average minimum is going to probably be 6 sets for a muscle group per session, right? Like, and we're talking about for the purpose of hypertrophy, right? Obviously, if we're talking about body comp, then that's totally different, right? But if we're talking about from a hypertrophy stimulus, I would say, if I gun to my head have to put an absolute minimum, it'd be like 4 sets, and you better make them like good sets, right? Versus like, okay, 6 sets is probably where most people are at, especially if you're using some sort of RPE or RIR, right? Like if you're using 4 sets, like one to two of those sets is going to failure, like if to be able to get the quality out of that magnitude. But that in itself, pushing to failure, can interfere with the frequency, right? Because you might get a little bit more sore because you push a little bit closer to failure, whereas it's like, okay, if I do 6 more moderate sets and I save a rep or two in the tank, that even though I did more volume, I might be a little less sore, right? So this is where like that individual response can really be dependent, right? And same thing for exercise selection as well, right? Like the pendulum squat is one for me, right? It's like, it just doesn't matter. Like if it's a heavy day, a hard day, a lot of sets, like if I do the pendulum, my quads are going to be sore, right? Because it just hits that position that way, right? So just like, I just know, like, so if I'm going to do it, I'm not going to be like, well, since it makes me sore, I'm just going to try and do 2 sets. It's like, no, you're going to be sore, right? So let's get out of this the most that we can get out of this. Let's make the juice worth the squeeze. So yeah, 4 absolute minimum, 6 probably more practical minimum for most people, right? So really, I will start probably breaking up stuff when it's like, you have to be basically needing over 8 sets a week, right? So, because I think for most people, it's like, if we look at the research, it's like, okay, 16 sets a week is kind of, the minimum or whatever for most people for hypertrophy, right? So it's like, all right, for hypertrophy, practically most people are going to be doing something between like 16 and 20 sets for a body part, right? But then we have to look at the nuances like, well, what if I'm doing exercises where, in one exercise, I'm really biasing the clavicular pec, and one exercise, I'm really biasing the costal pec. Do I count those as different things or the same things? And so you kind of got to go and see like, okay, can I get away with more volume now because I'm dividing these things up, right? Can I can I do 2 more sets of each or whatever? Because there's not as much, crossover in that exercise versus like, okay, maybe if you're doing, bicep curls, you don't separate those out as much, et cetera. So exercise selection is going to it's really going to muddy up those numbers, right? Which is why, it's a hard thing to put numbers to. So just be cognizant of like, okay, if I'm adding 2 things together, are they compounding in terms of like, 2 + 2 = 4? Or is it really like 2 + 2 = 3.5 because they don't completely overlap? If that makes sense, right? As much as I hate to use that whole reference of like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4.
It makes perfect sense. And the thought to my mind comes in is like the rabbit hole goes deeper, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's always more.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a fantastic answer.
I want to ask about counting volume because you reference 4 sets and 6 sets and 16 sets. So kind of using an example of when you and I trained together, we did like 4 circuits, 4 rounds of like a dual cable lateral raise, then a like dual cable front raise, and then we did some like rear delt pull downs, and we did that like 4 times with the increasing RPE up to like a failure on the final set for the most part. Mm-hmm. And then we did another circuit, and this one had like some anterior delt presses and some like rear delt rows, and it had some like arm stuff in there that was not related. But basically if we counted every one of those sets from RPE 6 to RPE 10, we did like 25 sets for shoulders. And then obviously there's like lateral and front and rear and stuff like that. But what of those sets, like when you're working from 6 to 10 RPE and stuff like that, like how many of these sets are we counting as work sets?
Yeah, so I'm not going to count a work set until I'm probably, we'll say well over 6. Like, I think that's the standard that you'll hear from most people in the evidence base is like, okay, it's a 6 RPE or whatever. I think, that goes a little bit higher as you become more advanced. So it's probably closer to like a 7. So of all of those rounds, like I definitely wasn't, counting that first set, right? Whereas you following me and kind of seeing where the weights were or whatever, like you were probably you were doing your working sets like at the very first one, right?
Second one,
On
yeah,
a
yeah,
couple of those,
yeah.
right? So we weren't training under the same conditions, right? Whereas it's like I was starting a weight to just like, hey, is this setup good or whatnot? And yeah, okay, cool. Then so like that first one, like I took like almost no rest between there or whatnot. Like it was not that was my warm up, right? And then it's like, okay, maybe the second count. And then when we're looking at something like the shoulder, like I don't think like you can't count a row as front
No,
delt
for
volume,
sure, for sure.
right? So even though we call them shoulders, right? So it's like, okay, but like there's no instance where a motion that is literally the opposite of the other motion, that those two count towards the same thing, right? So it's like, just because we call them shoulders, that'd be like if we called chest and lats like pecs and lats, we just called that trunk day, right? And it's like, okay, so how many sets of trunk did you do? And it's like, well, no, like when I do the dumbbell press, it doesn't count as a set of lats, right? And so if I do a anterior delt like press, it does not count as a upper back pull down, just because from a nomenclature perspective, we can call those all deltoids, just because they
Right.
share that
Right.
categorical muscle. So I'm gonna bait. That's where like that whole 2+2+4 thing comes in, right? Because it's like, all right, at what point in time do exercises overlap, and by how much, and at what point do they not, right? Because, well, all right, does a lateral raise count as front delts, right? Is it close? Is that close enough? It's definitely closer than the row, right? So it's like, okay, so you could be like, all right, so like if this is where it's like, we're working on algorithms to kind of make calculating these stuff like sane, because if you were to sit here and just think about it, right, like to write one program or evaluate one program would take you like half a day to like just get through all of the things or whatever, right? And then you'd still probably be way off, because it's like, all right, so as a lateral raise, is that 10% volume towards the anterior delt? There is an anterior delt division on the
Right.
lateral side, so it's like getting into all these nuances, you're getting into the weeds, and it's like, okay, you get as close as you can to like counting this. And I think this is where exercise selection and specificity really helps make things easier, because when you have a lot of exercises where they hit a whole bunch of muscles at once, you don't know, like, okay, well, how much was this pecs versus delts versus this triceps in this press, right? Do they all get equal or whatnot? And, you could make the arguments, and then, one person might have, a longer, humerus than another person has a bigger rib cage. And so it's different for different people or whatever. So it's, you basically get into an impossible, calculation to make, where it's like, okay, what if instead of having an aneurysm, I just focus on using a little bit of common sense and monitoring my progression?
Yeah, I mean, I think you summed that up really, really well, and especially when it comes down to the individual variability from person to person. It's one thing you said was really interesting, is because I will find myself, I'm like, well, this is kind of like that, and I don't know, and depending on who you talk to, people count it differently. So yeah, everything you said there makes perfect sense. So I know we're kind of coming up on about like an hour 15 here, so I want to be super respectful of your time. But before we hop off, what I want to do is just please plug yourself, tell everyone where you can find more information on you, the N1 stuff, maybe a little bit of information about any upcoming practicals, things like that. I know I had missed some, and I was super sour because I thought I wasn't going to be able to come until next year, and then Brian told me about the December one. But yeah, let everyone know where you can find you.
Yeah, so we are mainly on Instagram and YouTube. So you can follow me, Coach Kassem. I'm sure my name will be in the show notes or whatever, but it's Kassem. And then we have our YouTube is just N1 Education. We also have N1 Education, N1 Training on Instagram. Basically, the difference between those is N1 Education is where we're talking a little bit more in depth. So if you're a big time enthusiast, if you're a coach, our courses are probably going to be something that is really practical for you. If you're just getting into this, then following the information that we have on the training or our website, or that has the exercise library and the articles, that's going to be a better place to start. And it's going to be a more like monkey see, monkey do. Like, hey, here's the exercise, here's the cues and how to do it. Here's what it does and go. But you don't have to learn a bunch of anatomy terms or whatnot to understand the whys about things. So we're trying to hit people wherever they happen to be at in their fitness journey. And then the top tier thing that I think that you could do is to attend one of our live events. So basically, that's where we get to actually get hands-on with people, show them, the biomechanics and the anatomy in multiple perspectives, and actually, go from, all right, you're seeing this in the classroom, you're seeing this on a skeleton, you're seeing this on a live human, you're seeing this in exercises, and now you're doing the exercises, and you're helping coach or be coached by other people in those exercises. So it's basically it's basically the best possible learning experience you could get for upgrading both your understanding of the information, but also your ability to apply that information both as the athlete side and the coach side. I think we're the only people that, from a practical perspective, is that the trainers and stuff that come here, they actually get to practice their coaching skills. Like in most places, there's either no hands-on component, or you get a workout and it's like, okay, here's the workout, just like go do the workout. But what we're focusing on is like, hey, you probably came here to upgrade your business and your coaching skills, right? Probably more than you came to upgrade your own physique, right? But let's at least make sure you can accomplish both. But definitely, let's make sure that you don't just leave here with, well, you can do this exercise better, but you couldn't get any of your clients to do it better. You couldn't coach it better, right? And so we make sure that we incorporate that kind of like that full, that learning experience that kind of like covers all of your bases, right? So you're learning it first, second, and third person all over in that weekend.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I'm super excited. I'm putting my money where my mouth is. I will see you next week, Cass. Excited to learn from you and the rest of the N1 staff. So I just want to say thank you for coming on, sharing all this, incredible information with Brian, myself, and all the listeners, and all you guys. We will talk to you next week.
It was a pleasure.